Hello everyone, this presentation will be on hydrocephalus. The slides are made by the Indian Academy of Pediatrics as a part of the IAP-UG teaching modules 2015-16. Though hydrocephalus is a very broad topic and requires a lot of depth and detail, in this presentation I'll just be going over the basics and covering up about the etiology, the pathogenesis and a brief overview of the treatment. When we look at the term hydrocephalus as such, we can make out that it comprises of two parts. The first part, hydro, of course, referring to water, and the second part, cephalus, referring to head. So we can understand that it has something to do with the fluid imbalance and involving the head as a whole. So hydrocephalus is nothing but an accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid within the cranium abnormally. This picture is of course quite disturbing for a layman who will think that something is grossly abnormal with their child, and is a very easy spotter to identify for anyone, especially a clinician. So hydrocephalus is a very easy clinical diagnosis as a gross spotter. If you look at the normal pathway of CSF secretions, we know that CSF is secreted within the choroid plexus, and from the choroid plexus we know that it moves in through the lateral ventricle downwards, and downwards it moves in through the foramen of Monro into the third ventricle. Now some amount of fluid is also secreted into the third ventricle directly, and further through the cisterns it does come downward through the aqueduct of Sylvius. So through the aqueduct of Sylvius it does come downwards into the fourth ventricle, and from the fourth ventricle through the foramen of Mengendie moves into other cisterns and undergoes regular circulation. So we know that the amount of CSF produced is always equal to the amount which is absorbed. So there is never any stagnation as far as the CSF is concerned. And this diagram just shows it a bit more schematically, which makes it easier to draw. So through the choroid plexus there is some amount of absorption into the arachnoid villi and through the sagittal sinus, and as a whole in the pathway as such, whatever CSF is produced does get absorbed into the bloodstream. So it directly does get absorbed into the bloodstream, as a result of which there is never really an accumulation of fluid intracranially, because the intracranial volume is fixed. So we also know that there is something called the Monro-Kelly doctrine. So according to this principle, the combination of CSF plus blood within the cranium is a fixed constant. And like I was saying earlier, hydrocephalus is because of an increased ventricular size due to either an increase in volume of the cerebrospinal fluid which is present within. Now this could be because of impaired absorption, due to an obstruction in the path, or due to an increased production of CSF. So we subclassify hydrocephalus into two varieties: an obstructive type or non-communicating, which is because of an obstruction in the ventricular pathway; non-communicating because whatever CSF was there is not able to communicate through its pathway, hence it is obstructive. The second variety is non-obstructive or communicating variety, wherein there is an obliteration of the subarachnoid cisterns, or because of a decreased absorption, or both. So this diagram tries to show schematically both obstructive and non-obstructive varieties. If you do see the obstructive variety, it's because of an obstruction either at the level of the foramen of Monro or at the aqueduct of Sylvius. So either obstruction at both levels will result in an accumulation, because if we have an obstruction here at this level, which I am marking as A, then the entire upper portion, upper to A, above A, will get obstructed. Likewise, if there is an obstruction at the level here of B, at the level of aqueduct of Sylvius, there will be a complete collection and accumulation of fluid at that level. Further, if you see the non-obstructive or communicating variety, it's because of impaired absorption. So as a result of impaired absorption, there will be a complete flow of CSF through the normal pathway, and through the normal pathway it will come downward. Now if we see the obstructive variety, subvariety, we again see the causes of that. It could be congenital causes such as aqueductal stenosis or Arnold-Chiari malformation, which I will explain in detail in subsequent slides; Dandy-Walker malformation, which again I will explain in detail in subsequent slides. It could be because of spina bifida or even a vein of Galen aneurysm also. Now the causes of the obstructive type can also be because of a space occupying lesion like an intraventricular tumor or a posterior fossa tumor. And ventricular hemorrhage can be because of prematurity in the neonatal time or because of an arteriovenous malformation. If you look at the communicating type, it could be because of defects in the subarachnoid space, which could be because of infections. Congenital torch infections have an association with defects in the subarachnoid space, as well as with meningitis, which could be tubercular or pyogenic in nature. Also, other hemorrhagic causes can be subarachnoid or because of trauma. If you see the communicating type further, other abnormalities of the cerebrospinal fluid include overproduction because of a papilloma of the choroid plexus. So we know that. So if you consider the choroid plexus as a whole, whatever I am drawing in red is the regular choroid plexus cells and epithelium. Whatever I am drawing in this shade of yellow and orange is the papilloma. So if I use the color blue to highlight the normal synthesis of CSF, which is normal, wherever the red and the normal epithelium is, and from the papilla there is an abnormal coloration. So there is an abnormal amount of CSF which is formed through the papilloma, and hence the abnormal amount of CSF produced results in a communicating type of hydrocephalus. Further, if there is a defect of the cerebrospinal fluid absorption because of a congenital deficiency of the arachnoid granulation, so we know that in the arachnoid matter the granulation tissue and the granulations are present in a normal quantity. So if there is a congenital deficiency of this, there will not be any absorption. So if you see the pathophysiology as such, if there is an obstruction to the cerebrospinal fluid flow, there is ultimately a reversal of the ventricular fluid back into the periventricular white matter, resulting in demyelination and damage into periventricular white matter and later into the grey matter also. Now, clinical features: at birth there will be an increased head circumference and a rapidly increasing head size. Now, at birth it might be normal, but an abnormal increase in head circumference at birth will be noted. In the first 3 months, there will be an increase normally at 2 centimeters per month for the first 3 months, 1 centimeter per month for the second 3 months, and 0.5 centimeter per month for the next 6 months. If you consider the clinical features, there will be a large amount of irritability, poor appetite, vomiting, poor head control, and a classic sun setting sign which is seen. Images will explain that better, along with a tense fontanelle, delayed fusion of sutures, dilated scalp veins, and McEwen or crackpot sign positive if the child is more than 1 year old, classically. Typical child, what you see with hydrocephalus, where there is a ptosis which has developed in the right eye, along with the hemangioma like picture over the right forehead. Another child with hydrocephalus, where you can also see some systemic manifestations starting to come, a minimum amount of ascites you can see formed because of a fluid overload. If you consider the older children, you will tend to have signs and symptoms of raised intracranial tension, which has headache worse in the mornings, nausea, vomiting, along with papilledema, which is identified based on fundus examination. Blurred vision, drowsiness, a depressed level of consciousness, personality disturbances, and even gait abnormalities. It's important in these children to ensure that there is a serial head circumference measurement done, and head circumference more than a second standard deviation is always considered as abnormal. Presence of papilledema is also significant, along with abducens palsy and lower pyramidal tract regions of the lower extremities. This is a typical sunset sign, what you see in this child, where the gaze of the child is always in the downwards position as a normal neutral as opposed to a normal. So this is why we call it as sunset sign. If you consider the cornea of the child to be the sun, it typically appears as a sunset. Now, coming to Arnold Chiari malformation, we divide this into two types of type 1 and type 2. Type 1 Arnold Chiari is typically not associated with hydrocephalus and is seen in adolescence associated with headache, neck pain, and progressive spasticity. Whereas type 2 is congenital, and it is because of a failure in the pontine flexure during embryogenesis. Now, the Arnold Chiari malformation is mainly because of an elongation of the fourth ventricle and is because of a kinking in the brainstem, as a result of which there is a displacement of the medulla, the pons, the vermis, and the cervical canal. Now, this image on the left side, what you see is a typical normal cross-section, sagittal section of the brain. Whereas what you see in the second image is a downward displacement and hypoplasia of the cerebellum. So you can make out the hypoplasia here of the cerebellum along with a downward displacement as opposed to normal, and as a result of which the cisterna magna is obliterated. As you see, what I am tracing in red on the left side, in red on the left side is a normal space, whereas on the right side there is a complete obliteration and there is a downward displacement. Now, if you consider the clinical features, during infancy there will be a weak stridor associated with apnea. Progressively, there will be hydrocephalus of a mild to moderate variety worsening associated with myelomeningocele, abnormality of gait, and spasticity along with incoordination. Now, moving on to Dandy-Walker malformation, it's because of a failed development in the roof of the fourth ventricle, and this too is because of cerebellar hypoplasia. So, we know that the fourth ventricle is rhomboid shape, and the roof is formed by the cerebellum. Cerebellar hypoplasia results in failed development of the roof, and it's associated with other abnormalities such as corpus callosum agenesis. It can also typically present as a cystic dilatation of the fourth ventricle. So again, if you see a comparative image where on the left side you see a completely normal brain cross section where the cerebellar vermis is there associated with the fourth ventricle. On the right side there is a complete agenesis of the cerebellum which forms the roof, as a result of which there is a free flow of fluid resulting in fluid accumulation. If you consider the same on an MRI, the left side image showing a normal MRI, whereas the right side showing a complete cerebellar agenesis which results in the lack of the formation of the roof of the fourth ventricle. So this entire abnormal cystic collection, what you see is cerebrospinal fluid in excess. If you consider the clinical features, it's associated with an increase in the head size with a prominent occiput associated with cerebellar ataxia along with a complete motor and cognitive delay. But an important clinical sign is transillumination is positive. So if you shine a light at one end, it results in the light transmitting throughout. And this transillumination test is a confirmative way to clinically diagnose the condition of hydrocephalus. Now, diagnosis wise, if you consider one simple criteria, of course, is merely increased velocity of head growth, and mere increased velocity of head growth should raise a clinical suspicion of hydrocephalus. And in less than 15 months, a neurosonogram is diagnostic. That is, on cranial ultrasound itself, we will be able to pick up that there is an abnormal amount of fluid which is formed. On an X-ray skull, separated sutures associated with a silver beaten appearance or a shallow orbit, all of which raise a clinical suspicion of hydrocephalus, and characteristically separated sutures will have other differentials such as rickets, but a silver beaten appearance and a shallow orbit are diagnostic and pathognomic of hydrocephalus. On a CT or MRI, abnormally dilated ventricles will raise a suspicion. Congenital dilatation of ventricles is rare but can be considered as a subnormal variety of a normal child in less than 1%. But abnormally dilated ventricles should give a clinical suspicion for hydrocephalus, and serial monitoring is a must in these children. This is another CT which shows a dilated ventricle, and you notice in this image that the ventricular dilatation extends posteriorly much more than in the previous images. Now, if you consider the treatment for hydrocephalus, medical treatment is of course something which we give to ensure that the CSF production is cut down, and for that acetazolamide, which is a carbonic anhydrase inhibitor, is an essential drug, and it is given at the dosage of 50 mg per kg per day. But hydrocephalus tends to always go for a surgical correction in most cases, and reconstruction is generally done within the cranium itself. So what happens is we try to divert the cerebrospinal fluid to extracranial sites by the presence of shunt. Shunts are nothing but an abnormal connection between two spaces. So we create an artificial communication to ensure that the fluid gets drained. So what you see here is a shunt. So the types of shunts what we generally use are ventriculoatrial to ensure that the fluid comes from the ventricle into the atria, ventriculoazygous where it comes into the azygous venous system, ventriculoperitoneal, or a thecoperitoneal shunt. So if you consider a ventriculoperitoneal shunt, From the ventricle, a catheter is placed to ensure that there is a flow of the cerebrospinal fluid into the peritoneal cavity, as a result of which whatever accumulation of fluids was there within the cranium will come downwards, and there is no accumulation, and the head circumference will thus be normal. So, after an incision with the flap through a burr hole, the shunt is inserted, and another incision is made almost at the level of the clavicle, and a third incision is made at the level of the peritoneal cavity. And from the peritoneal cavity, fluid does get absorbed, and routine fluid excretion does occur. So, the complication, of course, of a ventricular peritoneal shunt will be a chance for infection as well as for a chance of obstruction. So, both of these are common complications which are associated, and this is another schematic which shows the flow from the ventricle through the catheter into the peritoneal space. If you consider the ventricular-atrial shunt, the first incision is made at the level of the cranium where a burr hole is made, then through the internal jugular vein, through the superior vena cava, directly into the right atrium to ensure whatever fluid accumulates does come downward and enters into the atrium. If you consider the thecoperitoneal shunt, abnormal connection is made between the subarachnoid space and the peritoneal cavity by placing a catheter. Of course, this is done for a communicating variety where the fluid does come all the way down through the thecal spaces. And post-shunt, often there is a need for repeated surgery or surgical corrections are rare, but in some cases it is indicated. And it's important to just know the names of the different ventricular peritoneal shunts which are available. One, of course, is Chabras, the second one is Pudens-Haken, and the third one is a Splitz-Holter valve. If you see the Splitz-Holter valve, you can see it in situ in this image, right here. So this valve, of course, has a role to ensure that the cerebrospinal fluid motion is regulated. And further treatments, of course, include ventriculostomy, where there is an opening of the ventricular system into the subarachnoid space through the lamina terminalis. And if there is a specific etiology for hydrocephalus, which could be because of TB meningitis, ATT starting is a must. And if proven to be a pyogenic meningitis, started on IV antibiotics for 21 days to ensure a complete cure and treatment. Like I mentioned earlier, complications of these shunts include blockage, infection, shunt dependence, and slit ventricle syndrome. So it's important to know the complications to watch out for and counsel for these warning signs to look for in these children. Other somewhat rare complications include migration of the tube, intestinal obstruction, peritonitis, and arrhythmias. So the final slide which is there in this presentation is to know the differential diagnosis for a large head apart from hydrocephalus: chronic anemia, rickets, osteogenesis imperfecta, epiphyseal dysplasia, chronic subdural corrections, metabolic conditions of all kinds, cerebral gigantism, familial megaencephaly, and hydrancephaly, all of which are DDs to keep in mind for a large head. And most of these can also be secondary to merely a thickened calvarium also. On that note, I come to the end of this presentation. The aim of this presentation was to give a brief overview on hydrocephalus and to give a brief orientation towards the pathophysiology associated as well as the treatment modalities involved. I thank IAP for ensuring these slides are made available online, and I thank all of you for listening and hope you tune in to the next video.